Leviticus, chapter 15. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron. He said, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when a man has a discharge from his body, that discharge is unclean. While the discharge continues, the nature of his uncleanness is as follows. Whether his body allows the discharge to flow or whether it retains it, he is unclean. Any bed the man lies on and any seat he sits on shall be unclean. Anyone who touches his bed must wash his clothing and wash himself and will be unclean until evening. Anyone who sits on a seat where the man has sat must wash his clothing and wash himself and will be unclean until evening. Anyone who touches the body of a man so affected must wash his clothing and wash himself and will be unclean until evening. If the sick man spits on someone who is clean, that person must wash his clothing and wash himself and will be unclean until evening. Any saddle the sick man travels on will be unclean. All those who touch any object that may be under him will be unclean until evening. Anyone who picks up such an object must wash his clothing and wash himself and will be unclean until evening. All those whom the sick man touches without washing his hands must wash their clothing and wash themselves and will be unclean until evening. Any earthenware vessel the sick man touches must be broken and any wooden utensil must be rinsed. When the man suffering from a discharge is cured, he must allow 7 days for his purification. He must wash his clothing and wash his body in running water and he will be clean. On the 8th day he must take 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons and come before the Lord at the entrance to the tent of meeting, and give them to the priest. The priest is to offer a sacrifice for sin with one of them, and with the other a holocaust. So the priest will perform the rite of atonement over him before the Lord for his discharge. When a man has a seminal discharge, he must wash his whole body with water and he shall be unclean until evening. Any clothing or leather touched by the seminal discharge must be washed and it will be unclean until evening. When a woman has slept with a man, both of them must wash and they will be unclean until evening. When a woman has a discharge of blood, and blood flows from her body, this uncleanness of her monthly period shall last for 7 days. Anyone who touches her will be unclean until evening. Any bed she lies on in this state will be unclean. Any seat she sits on will be unclean. Anyone who touches her bed must wash his clothing and wash himself and will be unclean until evening. Anyone who touches any seat she has sat on must wash his clothing and wash himself and will be unclean until evening. If there is anything on the bed or on the chair on which she sat, anyone who touches it will be unclean until evening. If a man sleeps with her, he will be affected by the uncleanness of her monthly periods. He shall be unclean for 7 days. Any bed he lies on will be unclean. If a woman has a flow of blood for several days outside the period, or if the period is prolonged, during the time this flow lasts she shall be in the same state of uncleanness as during her monthly periods. Any bed she lies on during the time this flow lasts will be in the same condition as the bed she lies on during her monthly periods. Any seat she sits on will be unclean as it would be during her monthly periods. Anyone who touches them will be unclean. He must wash his clothing and wash himself and will be unclean until evening. When she is cured of her flow, she will let 7 days pass. Then she will be clean. On the 8th day she is to take 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons and bring them to the priest at the entrance to the tent of meeting. With one of them the priest is to offer a sacrifice for sin, and with the other a holocaust. This is the way in which the priest will perform the rite of atonement over her before the Lord for the flow that caused her uncleanness. You must warn the sons of Israel of their uncleanness, lest they should die because of it, by being a defilement to my tabernacle which is set amongst them. Such is the law concerning a man with a discharge, anyone made unclean by a seminal discharge, a woman in the uncleanness of her monthly periods, a man or a woman with a discharge, a man who sleeps with an unclean woman.